This is the Health and Politics podcast. Prevention is the new cure.
And that's with former ministers James Bethell and myself, Steve Brine. Hello, James.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm all right. Listen, exciting news in the Brine household.
Oh, yeah.
My football team have won a game.
Oh, my God.
I know. I know. Let me just clarify that seeing as I'm a Spurs fan, that'll be the first and only mention I'll ever make of that for obvious reasons. But no, I won't say exactly where and who I manage, but I manage a boys' football team, as I've said to you offline before, which is basically 16 or 17, 15-year-old boys in a Sunday football league. And they started the season so well. You know, we were talking like, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-0 wins. And since Christmas, haven't won. But on Sunday, they actually managed to win 2-0, albeit against the bottom of the league. I'll give you that caveat. But they did manage to win a game. So, yes, Coach Brine is rather chipper about that.
I bet you are. Well, what a very, very worthy and lovely thing to do. And yes, it makes such a difference when they win, doesn't it? I mean, my wife says to me that
makes difference
if England lose at a Six Nations match, I said to her, I'm going to be in a grump all afternoon. She says to me, no, for 3 days. I'm like, no, that's not true. I'm not in a bad mood for conditions. No, you really are.
No, it's true. There's all sorts of studies, isn't there, about awful spikes in domestic violence when England get knocked out of the World Cup and things like that. I mean, God, it doesn't matter that much.
It makes me sound so shallow. But anyway, I also, listen, I love this time of year in one respect. Spring is out, daffodils. I mean, it's like optimism and good. But in the Bethell household, it's bad news. We get really bad hay fever, and I say this sort of in an embarrassing way because like allergies, hay fever, it's not very macho, but my whole family get it quite hard. My father used to spend 4 or 5 days in bed every summer. I often spend 2 or 3 days in bed with quite a big temperature. I had a temperature of 100 on Saturday.
Really?
Yeah, my little 10-year-old son gets it as well. And the allergy then leads to coughs and colds as well, rather annoyingly. And I used to, in the old days, have testosterone injections. So don't give that to you anymore. Not very good for your long-term health. But, to get me through GCSEs and A-levels and all of that, I had to have quite big hormone injections. So, and on Monday, there was the launch of the new Allergy Strategy. And we should talk about it sometime, Steve.
Yeah, I saw someone's been in touch with us about that. Yeah, let's do it. I
mean, London's hospitals are fuller at the peak of summer because of all of the respiratory disease and the not just allergies, but a lot of it is this new boom and phenomenon in allergies. We don't quite know what it's all about. Some of it is the highly clinical, hygienic lives children lead. Some of it is just the toxins that are in the air, the food, and the life that we have. But I think it is an overlooked part of the medical community. And I don't mean to sound sort of old-fashioned, but when we talk about prevention, Steve, we should really be talking about allergies as well and trying to keep a lid on them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a dust mite allergy.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah,
How did that go?
know. Well, it didn't go well when I was at university and the house was filthy. More on that at a future point. Listen, because we do health and politics on this show, I just thought we might just start because, oh my God, what a week it's been in politics.
Yeah,
a huge mess, of course, and massive distraction from Mandigate, which is obviously this continuing row over the appointment of Lord Mandelson as our ambassador to the US. But, unlike some who are saying it can't, it should be ignored, my constituents care about greater things, which of course is exactly what you say when you're constituency MP. I actually don't think it can be ignored any more than Partygate should have been ignored when that was happening. I don't know whether you caught the debate in the Commons on Monday when the Prime Minister made a statement on the subject. And it's not often I quote John McDonnell. Do you remember John McDonnell, who was Corbyn's shadow chancellor? and he said something really interesting, which really barely been picked up actually by a lot of the media, was that Starmer came to power in the Labour Party with no real hinterland in the Labour Party, a bit like Blair, if you like. And he lent very, very heavily on this organisation called Labour Together, and would run then by a chap called Morgan McSweeney, who obviously went on to be his chief of staff, and obviously lent heavily on people like Peter Mandelson. And so, they owed these people big time when they got in. And if you look at what's happened since, which sort of trail of events of how they certain disregard for process in getting Mandelson into the job, it does speak to, what did Mandelson need? What was Mandelson owed? And that's sort of, my God, how he must regret that decision, because it's just this massive, massive distraction, isn't it?
Oh, it's more than a distraction. I mean, it's become an obsession. There's so many
Mm.
more important things we should be talking about: our defence budget, welfare bill, the collapse of our
Yeah.
economy, and instead we're noodling on these sort of processy things. It's really heartbreaking, and it's so odd, isn't it, Steve, that this process-driven former permanent secretary who
Yeah.
he's a flipping lawyer. I mean, like, how did he get into a tangle on this stuff? We were both ministers. If a civil servant had come to us and said and had given us advice that we needed to go through certain hoops in order to do something, you just do it. And he just brushed them off. Very odd.
Yeah. Yeah, and that sort of goes to my point, which is, why was there this clamour to reward Mandelson in some way, shape, or form? And that really is that's the underlying weakness of this whole thing. Just finally on this, I just wonder, because, I used to chair a select committee, obviously, and we both appeared in front of them. But I don't, if I'm honest, and I hate to say this because I was such a proud member of Parliament and I loved being a member of Parliament, but I don't think MPs have covered themselves in huge glory over this. The humble address which the Commons passed, which was basically this rather grand thing to get the government to release all the Mandelson files. If you listen to Ollie Robbins' evidence on Tuesday, he sort of kept saying, look, well, now I'm not a senior civil servant, I can say what a mess basically the humble address was and how confused and muddled it is in terms of the things that it's asking for. And then you listen to sort of some of the grandstanding of the MPs, Emily Thornberry, at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And I just don't think that MPs have really covered themselves in any glory as the great scrutineers that they're meant to be. And it almost feels a bit like, come the moment, not come the Commons. And I feel a bit sad about that. I felt a bit sad about saying it, to be honest.
Well, I think that is a fair process observation. The House of Lords, of course, has done very well. Always.
Yeah, no, it has. It has.
Say a word for the
yes. A little bit of Commons v Lords here.
I actually had a different perspective, which is parliamentarians have struggled with this grim fact for 2 decades, which is that China, one of our biggest trade partners, and a huge geopolitical player with whom we have to have a relationship, is also incredibly predatory and is seeking to influence our parliament, our industry, our outcomes as a country. And Peter Mandelson did, as he has publicly, told everyone, a huge amount of work for Chinese companies, Wuxi Uptake, for instance, who acquired very sensitive British companies, including Oxford Genetics. And he made the case for this work in a very big way. And in retrospect, we all should be wondering to ourselves, do we really feel comfortable with big Chinese companies and investors like Tencent buying up British life science, some of which has got dual use, some of which is overtly incredibly dangerous to share, and to have their IP and sometimes personnel and capital stripped, taken off in a container to China, and never seen again. And in America, the atmosphere is very different in DC. They have the US Biosecure Act, they have the NSI screening, they have all sorts of controls on this. Doesn't mean that they've stopped it all, but we are completely flying blind on this and oblivious. And I just felt sad that there was this like, ooh, look what he's done moment, as if no one had been paying attention. Loads of people had pointed out what Peter Mandelson was doing. He would probably not unreasonably argue that he was doing it in plain sight and no one objected. But that's a mistake. What on earth were we thinking, having such an important player in the UK trade and commerce scene selling off our life science industry to the Chinese? I mean,
no, I completely
it's got a
agree.
really...
And isn't that just the point, mate? That that the people, he may well have been doing it in plain sight, but that's the job of the Commons. That's the job of parliamentarians. And when you've got a big majority, there's complacency. And above all,
but Steve, it's more than that. This has been going on for years, and the parliamentary authorities and our security services have not protected Parliament from undue influence from Russia, China, and our opponents. I don't say enemies; I say opponents. There's been a absolute lack of focus and complacency, and I don't know. I really hope this moment wakes us up to what's going on.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, but I mean, look, above all, isn't it? It's another week the message of the government on health and anything else is lost and not being got across. And that's before we even get to the whole point of authority on tough decisions that you need to take, on where you need the civil servants and the public to follow you. Another week, and that's just been lost. Just before we get onto the agenda this week, James, a message. We always like to read out messages from listeners. Alan Morton, prostate cancer awareness in Newcastle upon Tyne, following our interview with Oliver Kemp last week. He says there's a whole cohort of guys that we can easily miss. Prevention's what it's all about, and education's key. I'm trying to reach those frontline guys working in construction, infrastructure and heavy industry, encouraging them to have a test, finding most of them have never heard of PSA, nor just what it is that the prostate gland is all about, or indeed where it is, suggesting to management that agreeing to support workplace testing would help these guys enormously.
Yeah.
And that's great, isn't it? That's great. Yeah, well done, Alan, for you trying to get construction, infrastructure and heavy industry workers to talk about their prostates. That's exactly what you should be doing.
Exactly. Yeah. No, we need a copper feel for prostates.
Yes, that's a quote. So look, busy show again. Welcome along. This podcast, Prevention is the New Cure. It's two former health ministers, that's us, discussing the big stories in health and politics every Thursday and chatting with some great guests, one of them coming up in a moment. So thanks for choosing us. This week, we're going to focus in the first half of today's show on the biggest health prevention measure next to clean water that we can take, otherwise known as vaccination. So what we're going to do, James, is we're going to consider two stories on the positive side of the ledger and two where, as my teachers would have said, we just need to do better. Yes. And that starts with the report from the latest report, the fourth report from the UK COVID inquiry, which praises the last government on the extraordinary feat, their words, of the vaccine rollout. So we're going to start there.
Then we're going to take a look at an ongoing House of Lords committee, which is looking at failing childhood vaccination rates. And Steve, the figures are very, very stark.
Are they? Yeah. Also, part of this discussion, we're quite excited to touch on some great results from a new jab given to pregnant women, which is driving down one of the main reasons young babies are admitted to hospital before they reach the age of 1.
And finally, as part of this, we're going to dive stateside, where I'm going to be in a couple of weeks' time, to check in on what RFK Jr has been up to. He's been in front of Congress, and suffice to say, it wasn't dull or boring.
It never is. We look forward to hearing that and your reflections when you're there. Thanks for listening to the show. As we do that, if you feel like hitting the subscribe button, you'll get our brand new episodes that land around lunchtime, early afternoon every Thursday. And I mentioned that message we had. You can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507 and you can email us hello@preventionisthenewcure.com. Yeah, so let's go back to the top, James, and our part of our vaccine wrap, if you like. I'm going to try and bundle these stories together because I think they all sit as part of a narrative. So the UK COVID inquiry published its latest report last week, and he says, without any hint of irony, it was actually positive for once. I think Boris might have enjoyed reading it. Said that the vaccine rollout prevented an estimated 20 million deaths globally in its first year, with the UK among the fastest to deploy it at scale. It was a rare moment, it said, when the system worked, science, regulation, procurement, delivery, all aligned. For those designing future prevention systems, the question is simple. Why can we do this in crisis but not for chronic disease? So I really enjoyed reading this bit of the report. James, you were in the engine room for vaccines in the department at the heart of government. Was this success replicable or was it completely unique?
Well, Steve, I slightly bristle at your characterization that this was a rare moment that worked. Listen, there was a ton of things.
That's what they say.
Well, no, that's not right. If you read all the modules put together, there were tons of things that worked incredibly well, as Hallett has recognized. And the vaccines always are the golden star and attract the most attention because it's the way out. It's completely natural that everyone wants to feel good about the vaccines because this was how we were going to close down the horrible, nasty lockdowns and kill off this killer virus. So, you know, it is the golden child of the whole response. But I'd just like to put a shout out for everyone else who was involved in different parts of the response, in hospitals, in social care, in immigration, in, you know, channels, the police, you know, loads of people did amazing things and plenty of it worked really, really well. So sorry to sort of get a bit sort of
no, good challenge.
Sentimental on that. Can I just make a little shout out for a piece that you didn't mention? So you clearly didn't read the whole report, which was the therapeutics part of the module. And you may have noticed that I got mentioned 8 times in it. And Judge Hallett gave me a big shout out and said that many of my recommendations should be followed up, which in terms of witness outcomes is about as good as you're ever going to get out of the COVID inquiry. So for me, it was a... hitting the ball out of the park. And just a practical point here is vaccines do work. They are fantastic, but they don't always work. There are plenty of previous diseases and epidemics where the vaccines just didn't turn up on time. So you do need to have a fallback plan. And for us, we did invest a lot in therapeutics. They did prove to be pretty good. And had the vaccines not worked, we would have had that plan. So, and it's a bit of a shame we've backed off that kind of investment as well. But listen, Steve, your main point is absolutely the right point. When we needed to do it, we absolutely delivered 92% vaccine rollout at a relatively low cost, and it was with a huge amount of public support. So, Steve, why on earth are we struggling to do that now? It's completely baffling.
And for me, James, the sort of the tone, if you like, is that the system worked because the system temporarily stopped behaving like the system. And it did that. And we've talked a bit before, haven't we, about how, when it comes to regular vaccinations, we're still doing them through a rather analogue, through your GP practice way. We're not using pharmacy as much as we might and could and should. And so, why doesn't what happened during the pandemic automatically translate into normal NHS reform? That, for me, is the key political tension. So, I think there is also a point there, isn't there? And it does say this in the report, is that the system is intentionally built to be slower but safer and more equitable. But I'm not sure I want that. I mean, yes, of course, I want the system to be safe, but I don't want the system to be slow. And I want the system, you can go back to the conversation that we may well be having with Seb Rees later from the IPPR about systems, is that, yes, the system worked because the system didn't behave like the system. So maybe we should look at the system.
I agree. And it's multifactorial. But if there was one thing that I'd really emphasize is that we focused on patients and we said to ourselves, how do we make it most convenient? We want people to be able to pretty much walk in to book digitally if you want, or actually just turn up. I mean, this whole thing about posting someone an appointment for a vaccine. I mean, what planet?
We're doing it. We are literally still doing it, aren't we?
And then secondly, all the records captured, so there was no ambiguity. It appeared in your app immediately. Whereas I've got 4 children, trying to keep track of their vaccines is a flipping miracle. And I never know which one. I mean, it's just a nightmare. And then lastly, just on in terms of actual access, do you know how old you have to be to basically qualify for the COVID vaccine at the moment?
No.
85.
Of course, yeah. We're still in the older.
How is that a great idea? Are you really telling me that a 65-year-old won't benefit from getting a COVID? That won't have some kind of impact on their long-term health? You catch COVID when you're 65. That's not great. Even 55. No. And why are we drawing back access on the basis of an age-old formula about trying to keep people out of hospitals? I mean, basic qualification for vaccines is far too tight.
Yeah, and the basic premise, of course, of so much prevention is what does it do to stop people being to the acute admissions?
I know.
It has to be so much. Yeah, it has to be so much more intellectual than that, doesn't it? I was reading a piece in the BMJ this week. Actually, was saying about how people get horrible foot conditions could be part of long COVID with a lighter touch version of the disease. Not sure if you saw the piece, but therefore then speaks to yes, younger people can get it. Younger people can get it with a lighter touch COVID, and therefore there are implications from that. But anyway, so that was sort of, if you like, witness number 1, which I suppose is on the positive side of the ledger. On the maybe second item, the negative side of the ledger, is what your place of work, almost former place of work, the House of Lords, is doing at the moment on childhood jabs. Yeah.
So there's a very good report being put together, interviewing experts on the collapse, really. I mean, maybe let's do it. I mean, definitely the decline of efficacy. We're behind on all 14 of the WHO qualified jabs at the moment. It is particularly acute in pockets of the population where the NHS doesn't have strong reach. My personal view, and I think that this is the strong evidence, is that you can't, in this country, blame this on some kind of hesitancy epidemic. There isn't widespread anti-vax feeling. It is in some small communities. Where there is a question-answer gap. Plenty of people, quite reasonably, including mums and dads who might be concerned for their children, would like to have answers to their questions put to them, possibly in a language that they fully understand, possibly in their own terms, possibly by someone that they trust and isn't some kind of distant authority figure, and actually someone who they intrinsically don't trust. So that is definitely a gap, but that is different to, say, in America, where there is a tradition and widespread politicization and weaponization of anti-vax feeling. So I strongly reject any efforts by those responsible to place this on any kind of patient or consumer rebellion. It is really a failure of the system to meet.
Yeah, I agree.
A very simple challenge. I mean, we've done vaccines before. This is not a hard thing to get right. It's diabolical. It really is.
Yeah, so the Lord's inquiry, they launched it back in March, and we talked about it at the time, of course. They're already warning that MMR uptake in England is now below 85% in some areas, so that's well below the 95% target. And, it's not just a public health issue, it's a cultural issue, and as you say, it's a system issue. And we did a big report when I chaired the Select Committee at the end of the last Parliament as part of our prevention inquiry around vaccines, and I think our sort of core conclusion wasn't subtle, if I may say. It was basically that the system was drifting away from herd immunity, and this required, we said, more flexible, accessible delivery models and a broader workforce to deliver vaccines. So, pharmacies, students, retired staff, pop-ups, etc. And I think I said then as chair, this is a warning signal. It's not a slow burn issue. And, of course, we've since seen that the UK's lost its measles status. And so, it'd be very interesting to see where the Lords go on this when they come out there with their report. But of course, it'll be more interesting to see what ministers actually do with it and whether they decide to update the vaccination strategy and to challenge the system to do something very different. So let's then bring in evidence piece number 3, James, which is on the positive side of the ledger. And we were texting about this, weren't we, last weekend? Because I thought this was a great story. So a vaccine given to women during pregnancy, I want to make sure I get this right, which protects newborns against nasty chest infections, is cutting hospital admissions, so back to that point we were saying then, of babies by more than 80%. So the virus is called RSV. It affects many babies in their first few months of life. It can leave them gasping for breath. It's horrible, struggling to feed. More than 20,000 babies end up seriously ill in hospital in the UK every year. But since 2024, women have been offered this vaccine from 28 weeks of pregnancy to protect their newborn babies. And the study now that's come out from UK Health Security is basically that it gives, and these are their words, excellent protection to babies when they're most vulnerable to RSV. I think this is great. This is classic invest to save. And I wonder whether this kind of in utero vaccination is going to become, I think this is just the start of that journey. And this looks like it shows positive, doesn't it? It looks like it shows positive direction of travel in this space.
Well, Steve, I think that's a really powerful point, and it breaks a very nasty taboo in the health field. A lot of conservative thinking doctors and clinical researchers are incredibly reluctant to vaccinate pregnant women. And I found I signed off the vaccines during the pandemic. It was my administrative role. And when I saw the clinical trials come through, I absolutely insisted that they included pregnant women. And I got written reassurance that this was going to be the case. And I gave this evidence to the inquiry. When the clinical trials came back, they had omitted pregnant women, despite the fact I had asked for reassurance that they would be included. And it was I would say it was the one time when the system kind of flatly lied to my face. On the whole, as a minister, I found that if you asked the right questions and had a good relationship, people were very straight with you. This was the one time when I got absolutely lied to, full on. And I was incandescently upset. And it led to many pregnant women then not wanting to take the COVID vaccine because they said, not unreasonably, but hold on a second, you haven't done clinical trials on them. There's probably a reason why you didn't do clinical trials on them. And now you're asking me to take it. That doesn't make sense. So that is a not illogical conclusion. So I think that this is a really good breakthrough for doctors and the clinical system to have the courage to go into a sort of formerly taboo area. And also, it's fantastic for mums. My little daughter Elizabeth had RSV when she was 8 weeks old. We did a week in hospital, and she went to sleep in my arms with tubes coming out of her. It was horrible, truly horrible. I thought she was a goner, and she was clawed back. And thank you very much indeed for the specialists involved in the ED who looked after her. But my goodness, wouldn't it be great if this came, as you said, a pattern that we could head off, a number of baby diseases through pregnancy vaccines? I think that's a lovely idea.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating what you say about the official advice, and not least in the light of the conversation we were having at the start of the show about Mandelson. But I suppose, the 2-for-1 biology argument is now evidence-based. It's not theoretical. And, we sort of moved beyond the idea, haven't we, that vaccinating during pregnancy protects mother and baby as a hypothesis, if you like, which many have had for a long time. And so this data shows a clear downstream effect. And, I think that makes maternal vaccination one of the few interventions that directly converts adult behavior in a healthcare setting into sort of pediatric system relief at scale, if you want to put it in those terms. So I thought that was really good. And, we could be entering a sort of programmable immunity area for the next generation. And, the challenge is therefore there, isn't it, to the life sciences sector to, what next, please? Should we move on to the final and the fourth piece of evidence on this, which is RFK Jr.? Over to you, James.
Well, we've kept a watching eye on what's going on in America because it's so influential. An interesting dimension is that this very confusing, weird jumble of ideas that come out of RFK, which includes some really good stuff on the need to lead a healthy life and to take exercise and be careful about what you eat. And he is 73 years old and does 30 pull-ups, which is pretty flipping impressive. Mixed with totally bonkers, anti-vax, anti-science, anti-empiricism of the most destructive and dangerous type. It appears that there has been an inflection point in White House thinking, that they really do want to ditch the anti-vax stuff, that the proportion of American voters who go along with this, it emerges, is tiny and is not growing. Whilst it does activate a very important and energetic part of the base for Trump, it also toxifies and undermines his overall message. And by the way, it's terrible policy that kills people. I mean, as a side point.
Other than that.
And so RFK was on the Tucker Carlson show talking for, I think, an hour and a half. Did not mention vaccines once. Ooh, interesting. So maybe, Steve, maybe we've reached a point where the Make America Healthy Again movement is going to focus on upstream, realistic interventions that tackle America's very dangerous health catastrophe and starts dropping the kooky anti-empiricism stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I just wonder whether, the MAGA movement, the wider MAGA movement, has somewhat had its faith knocked by the Iran adventure, because this is the opposite of what they believed a Trump presidency would be. And so maybe that's caused them to think again, reevaluate in other areas of the Make America, complete the last bit of that sentence.
But I think
maybe. The only thing I would just sort of say, I just wonder how much of this sits in the media dynamics, though, James. There's well-established tendency in public health debates in the US for figures like RFK to be sort of pre-sorted, if you like, in media coverage. So once someone's labelled as a vaccine skeptic or activist, there's a risk that everything they say is treated as self-discrediting, even when they raise legitimate things. And therefore, I wonder if it leads to a bit of a sort of shorthand dismissal rather than engagement with the claims on their merits. And of course, we don't believe that there are no scientific merits to his argument around vaccines. But, he is the health secretary in the States. And I worry that there's a dynamic that can create a sort of political communication problem out there, and people then stop listening. So it'd be really interesting when I think you're on the West Coast, aren't you? In a few weeks' time, be really interested when we chat down the line from there during the podcast as to what you feel. Just because, when you're in the States, it seeps into you, doesn't it, through media coverage and conversations that you have. And I'm sure you'll be having lots, but it'd be really fascinating to sort of pick your brains on that when you're out there as to how that media agenda pre-sorts people into good guy, bad guy, and then stops there being any sensible debate.
I will do, and I will report back. Can I just flag that I take a slightly different view to you on this one, Steve? I think it's more of a doorstep issue than a media narrative. We've seen in America rolling outbreaks and epidemics, particularly for measles, all across the country, but particularly in the high anti-vax areas. 26 outbreaks of measles this year alone. There's also whooping cough, avian flu, and other flus. If you look at the actual fear factor amongst mums and dads in mainstream America, it has shot up. And I think the pennies dropped amongst the voters that dropping these vaccines is a huge collective mistake. And people are going to start worrying about getting on the tube or going to a restaurant, because who else is going to be in the room breathing on them and sharing their diseases? So I think it's at that level that this is beginning to cut through.
What we should do, and I should give you this as homework, James, let's think as to who we could talk to from the US health world about how these issues are playing in the lead up to the midterms. Because, the midterms will be what they will be, and I suspect the Democrats will do reasonably well, but maybe not as well as they might think. And it'll be very interesting to know, and of course it's all supposition as to how issues play in leading to an election result. But it'd be fascinating if we could talk to somebody to understand, where health plays. I mean, I could think of anyone in this country, many people could talk to as to how health will play in the local elections coming up here in May and the next general election. But it'd be fascinating to get somebody, because we do love our stateside look, and I think our listeners are interested in that. So we'll try and do that. Brilliant. Listen, we're going to take a quick break, mate, and then we'll come back and we'll chat with this week's live guest. Welcome back. Prevention is the New Cure. It's myself, Steve Brine, and Lord James Bethell. So we've got a guest now. A major new report from the think tank IPPR finds that there is no evidence, I've underlined that part, Seb, that insurance-based healthcare systems outperform tax-funded systems. The analysis, which spanned 22 high-income countries, concludes that switching the NHS to a European-style insurance system, often talked about, would not improve performance across measures of capacity, access, quality, efficiency and equity, and no doubt prevention. And this sort of lands at a moment when the system is financially stretched, but rhetorically, it's committed to the so-called shift left. And I guess the tension is, can funding reform actually drive prevention, or will acute pressures always win? Let's discuss it. Welcome to Prevention is New Cure, Seb Rees from the IPPR. Hi, Seb.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. James and I have been really looking forward to chatting to you. I saw you at the Patrick Maguire dinner a few weeks ago, didn't I? Look, your report argues that it wouldn't make much difference to make a change in the overall model, which you maybe increasingly hear from the populist right in this country, that, we're running out of time, running out of patience with the NHS. Just sort of as succinctly as you can, Seb, just tell James and I how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, of course. So in this piece of work, we wanted to look at a basket of countries that were roughly comparable to the NHS. So we were keen to identify countries that were of a similar level of wealth, similar size to the UK, and compare data on those countries across a number of different domains. So there were 5 domains that we looked at. The first was about capacity in the system. How much resource do you have to be able to play with, I suppose, to provide healthcare? Second one was about access. How quickly can you access care when you need it? Third one was about quality. So is healthcare effective across a number of indicators? Fourth one was about equity. So particularly looking at access there, how fairly allocated is access? If you're poorer, do you have the same standard of access to care to a wealthier person? And the final one was efficiency. So looking at how well health systems convert their capacity into outcomes. Across all those indicators, what we found is there's not really a huge amount of difference between system types in terms of performance. So you can find that social insurance systems, like they have in Germany or the Netherlands or France, tend to have slightly more capacity available to them and as a result tend to have slightly shorter waits. Tax-funded systems overall tend to have lower barriers to access to care, so lower financial barriers in particular, tend to do maybe slightly better on care quality, but definitely seem to be slightly more efficient. So they seem to be better at converting the resources they have into health outcomes. So I suppose the overall news there is that there's not really any difference between those different types of systems in terms of their performance. I think the slightly more depressing news for those of us working in UK healthcare policy is that on most indicators, the NHS tends to perform worse than the average of countries across different system types, but also worse than other tax-funded systems. I think the other kind of slightly depressing news is on indicators where the NHS used to be quite a high performer. So those were things like being quite an efficient system and a productive system, given the amount of resource that we put in, and on care quality, that some of the edges that we had in the past no longer seem to be there. So this report is going to mix news for those of us who support the NHS model. In some senses, it is true that shifting models would be a huge and we think pointless distraction from the real challenges service faces. But at the same time, clearly something's got to change in the current system if we want to make sure that we're getting better outcomes.
Yeah, and you call it Bismarck versus Beveridge Revisited. Does the model shape the outcome? James?
Nice title. Seb, that's absolutely fascinating. One thing that worried me a bit about the report is that it I know it doesn't really, but it creates a sort of dichotomy between one system or the other system. But actually, it's more of a blend than that. And that's particularly important with the challenge that we have at the moment, because whilst you referred there to access and clinical performance, what we're dealing with is an aging population and a chronic disease explosion. And so actually the behaviors of people, and I mean that in the broader sense of the word, and the environment that they live in are even more important, and how the health and care system interacts with the challenge of trying to improve environments and to rewrite the social contract on behaviors so that people are activated, take an interest, and feel empowered to look after their own health. That is more important in some ways than access or clinical performance. And there actually the funding and financing models are important, because if people have no incentive to look after their health, if they have no accountability, if they can drink, gamble, whatever, all the way to middle age and then just walk into A&E consequence free, I'm not sure if that's going to work forever. And if local councils don't pay the bills for, or employers aren't paying the bills for workforce dropping out and landing on the welfare budget, does that make sense? So that there is a possibility for having a conversation about how you fund and finance health in a way that meets the challenges of today. What insight did the report provide on that type of stuff?
So when we originally started looking at the data on this, we kind of constructed a set of hypotheses about how different systems should perform. So one hypothesis would be, because social insurance systems tend to be funded by payroll contributions, which remain pretty consistent over time, you should have kind of more stability in funding long-term than in tax-funded systems, where if political pressures grow on some other part of the state, you kind of deliberately defund healthcare, but reduce funding to healthcare or cut back on capital expenditure or those kind of things. In the report, we found actually the kind of theory doesn't really add up to what happens in practice. And I think there's something similar going on in terms of the theoretical existence of incentives in social insurance systems, which is employers pay for some of, in partnership with employees, pay for healthcare. That should, in theory, give employers a stronger incentive to look after employee health, because costs are likely to be limited as a result. I think when you look at how the theory stacks up with what happens in practice, we don't see a huge amount of relationship between that kind of theoretical explanation and what actually ends up happening. So there's not really any systemic evidence that in single payer tax funded systems that we do worse in terms of things like investment in employer health. So I think that it's important, and one of my kind of obsessions in health policy is I think we often try to construct theoretical types of organizational structure or funding mechanism, hoping that they make the difference in terms of kind of stacking up the right incentives to do better. And often we spend a lot of time thinking about how you construct the ideal type of organizational type or funding model, and those things don't end up adding up. I think one of the challenges here is that as you say, in tax-funded systems, actually a lot of the driver is political rather than it being kind of market incentives. I think that's just a plea for us to make better political choices. I think often we kind of duck some of those realities of we can choose to do things differently. We can choose to provide additional incentives for employers to do better. We can regulate more effectively. All of those things are things that we have political control over. I think part of the problem is that we tend to duck some of those hard choices, which exist in every system.
Yeah.
But I think you're right; they are more acute in systems like the NHS.
Well, I hear that, and Chris Whitty speaks very, very bluntly about, politicians, could you do your job, and we'll do our job, and he's totally got a point. But in other areas, if you look at what's happened in the energy field in the last 20 years, funding and finance has been used to dramatically change behaviours, our entire carbon economy. If you look at education, the university system's been turned on its head. People pay for their own. I didn't pay for my university education. I'm afraid to say you probably did. So their funding and finance has been used, for good and bad. Mm-hmm. If you look at pensions, there's been a lot of action in the last 10 years to get people to contribute to their pensions, quite thoughtful little tweaks. I'm not talking about a massive revolution, but automatic enrollment, big revolution there. Are you really saying that there's nothing that can be done in funding and finance to be a catalyst for change and to try to look at the provision of health and the engagement of communities and the shaping of environments in different ways?
So I think that I think the important thing to note here is that the mechanism that you have in a system like the NHS is not necessarily creating additional incentives or shifting funding mechanisms. It's actually paying for the things that you want to achieve. And I know we've had this conversation quite a lot, but I think one of the real challenges in the NHS at the moment is we have this idea that we want to shift left, we want to do more in communities, we want to pivot towards prevention. But the thing that we pay for in health systems is activity. And most of that activity that we're paying for at the moment is secondary care elective activity. I think one of the real challenges we're going to have over the next few years is about where that trade-off hits, where healthcare spending, particularly in the acute sector, is in some ways eating health. So you spend more and more on elective secondary care because you've made a pretty overt political choice to prioritize that, and there's less and less available to spend on wider population health, less available to spend on primary and community care. I think in some ways there is a kind of change happening in real time that I think we've all commented on, which is that kind of top line sense that the most important thing in the NHS is elective performance is starting, I think, to drop off the agenda a little bit as the thing that we think the public care most about and therefore we want to achieve. I think we are seeing a change in attitudes and a bigger conversation about, look, given this huge amount of money that we collectively invest in health and care, what are we actually trying to achieve out of it? And how can we pay for better outcomes rather than just pay to increase activity? So I think that is changing over time, but a much more simple way to solve the problem than to fiddle around with the fundamental structure or the funding model is to pay for the things that we want to achieve. And I think we're slowly getting there. I think we've got a bit of a political fight on our hands.
What do you think are the green shoots?
So I think the green shoots are, there are a number of things going on. I think one of them is interest, which is, I've been talking to people about the usual monthly drop of statistics that we get out of the NHS, where we get referral to treatment target waiting times, we get A&E performance, we get cancer performance. One thing I've subtly noticed over the last year is that kind of monthly interest that health journalists and policymakers have in the performance indicators is not capturing attention in the way that it used to.
Not.
So I think
we don't have them on the show.
Part, and it captures attention only because government have said we've got a big target around electives and people are interested in whether they're going to hit that target and they're interested in what the trajectory looks like. But as a kind of pure indicator of health system performance, I think people don't care about elective weights as much as they used to. So I think that's a kind of one development, is there's a shift in interest in terms of what matters in health systems. I think there's a second thing, which is kind of demographic change, and it relates to the first point. But we clearly have a huge amount of attitudinal change happening across society, particularly amongst young people, in terms of thinking about the performance of health systems as really being about equipping us to live healthy lives. So I think we're kind of slowly seeing a kind of change in attitudes, which is what we care about when we put a huge amount of money into health and care services is not those kind of top line performance indicators, or at least if it is, it's probably not electives first. What it really is kind of being supported to live the kind of life that I want to live. So I think we are slowly seeing some changes in terms of public attitudes. I think there's a question of when the politics catches up. I think we're living in a slightly unreal environment at the moment where government's trying to do three things at once. They're trying to hit the elective target, they're trying to reorganize the NHS, and they're trying to do the kind of left shift, prevention pivot, shifting to community. I think we're slowly getting to a point in which it becomes clear that those things are difficult, if not impossible, to all do at once.
Yes.
And we're hoping that the political decision-making then adds up to saying, look, if we really think about what the public care about, in terms of health system performance, it's about access to primary and community services. It's about access to mental health support. Electives is important, but it's not the only thing that we care about. But I think there's a kind of wider conversation going on here about really caring about health, not just healthcare. And I think that's a kind of positive political platform to develop from. It'll be interesting to see as politics becomes more contested and we develop a kind of true 4 or 5 party system in England, whether or not someone seizes that mantle of this being about population health, not just about kind of top line healthcare performance. I think that's a kind of open debate at the moment.
Wouldn't that be nice, Seb? I noticed that the Secretary of State came and spoke at the launch of your report. Presumably they were quite happy with this because it kind of speaks to the narrative which they're trying to push back against reform, which is that we need to focus on delivery. This is not about organisation. Say the ministers that are obviously embarking on a massive reorganisation. Presumably Wes and Alan Milburn and the guys over at DHSC were quite happy when this landed.
I think there's the politics of all of this at the moment, which is, I think there is a genuine sense, not just in the kind of high politics, but also amongst the public, that there is a real risk that there are parties on the populist right at the moment who do not believe in the founding principles of the NHS. And I think it's a kind of quite a powerful political argument for the Labour Party. Very interesting if you listen to the speech that Wes gave at our launch event, that a lot of the focus of that speech was about kind of what healthcare looked like in this country before 1948 and what it looks like afterwards. And I think that's still a really powerful part of the Labour brand. So I think there's something political about this. Though I do think that there's kind of, as we point out in the report, there's no real room for complacency here. I think that on almost every indicator that we looked at, with the exception of out-of-pocket expenditure and spending on billing and management, that the NHS performs badly. So I think that there's a double-edged sword. I think it's always important to point out that NHS-style models are better than an alternative, which is having to pay huge sums out of pocket for healthcare and being denied access to healthcare on that basis. But that's not really the alternative that we're talking about in general. I think most countries tend to fund their healthcare systems in relatively similar ways, and those are usually kind of compulsory insurance models. So I think it's kind of important to go where things are at and ask some kind of more scrutinizing questions about how we get better performance out of our current model. I think there's something really interesting in this report about looking at models so one of the conclusions of this report is, in healthcare, as in so many other things, you get what you pay for. And a lot of the systems that we talk about that tend to do better in terms of both funding model types do spend substantially more money on healthcare than we do per capita, and the kind of purchasing power adjusted. So making like what you're able to buy for what you put in. But I think one of the interesting things in this report is that there are countries like Italy and Spain, for instance, which spend a similar amount on healthcare to the NHS and get far better results. So I think there's kind of no room for complacency, even in terms of thinking about the most similar comparators. There are real questions about why we get less for what we put in than those countries too.
Yeah, Seb, brilliant. I think we could kick this around for some time. I know there's loads of other things you're working on, not least talking about young people and how they view the NHS. We'll come back to that at some future point because we love chatting with you. You're always very thoughtful. But thanks for coming on the show, Seb.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Seb.
What's the takeaway from that, James? What do we think?
Seb, I've got a huge amount of time for IPPR. I've been a fellow there and I'm a big supporter. But this report is closing down a really important debate in a way that I feel really uncomfortable with, Steve. The public want to have a conversation about how we go about doing health. It is very angry that it feels that some people turn up who haven't paid into the system and get a service that they didn't deserve. There's a lot of antipathy to people who don't turn up to appointments. There's growing resentment to people who don't look after themselves and then cost a fortune. Employers are just wondering what on earth they're getting for their 2% nicks. I mean, there's a lot of people who are paying into the system who are wondering what the hell they're getting out of it. And models for both funding programs and for financing capital and investment are both evolving incredibly quickly around the world. So we're going to shut all that down and just try to stick with the 1948 perceived model. I think that's crazy. And in fact, we need to rewrite the social contract and to start trying out and try and kill some sacred cows. I really think we should, Steve.
You know, I hear you. And that 10-year plan exercise, the consultation exercise that led to the 10-year plan, it was described as the biggest listening exercise in the history of the NHS, which in many ways it was.
Yeah.
The one thing that it didn't do, and it specifically refused to do, was allow anyone in all of those conversations, we're talking public, stakeholders, policymakers, the one thing it refused to do was talk about the model. And that is inherently political because, of course, it doesn't suit this Secretary of State to do so. And he wants to create that dividing line between him and Nigel Farage's party. And that's really what I was getting at in that bit of the discussion. So, I don't...
Listen, if you think, I mean, if anyone thinks that we're going to be able to afford to roll out a massive expansion of neighbourhood health without looking at different ways of funding and financing it, of bringing in the beauty sector, of having hybrid models between public and private, they're smoking. I mean, what are they thinking? I mean, we should have a creative and interesting conversation about this, not close it down.
Yeah. Listen, final bit of the podcast today. We just go to our last bit. PE at school, as in physical education at school, put off a generation. This is a new Age UK survey that came out earlier in the week, James, that found that over a third of older people say negative experiences at school PE put them off exercise for life. Is this nostalgia or is it a prevention failure baked in early? I loved PE at school. I was not somebody who tried to get out of it. I did sometimes do it in my pants, and I sometimes did it with PE kit from the lost property bin when I forgot my kit. But I actually really enjoyed it, and I did rugby and cricket and football and swimming and athletics and all that stuff. But lots of people have negative experiences with PE, they're being picked last, all that sort of stuff, and that maybe puts them off PE. I heard this story this week, and I heard lots of coverage on it, and obviously the media went to town on it in many ways. Is that a bit of an excuse? Am I being unkind in saying that?
Well, no, you're not being unkind. I mean, listen, it is undoubtedly true that competitive sports leave some people feeling cheesed off and triggers all sorts of negative emotion. I know plenty of people who feel crushed and embarrassed and, terrible when they are put in a position when they are physically exposed. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for that. I went to incredibly hearty public school. I run my own family as a sort of physical jerks exercise. We all do park runs, and we're unbelievably competitive about who's got the fastest park run at the moment. It's Jacob, by the way, but Lizzie's, going to beat him one day. So I run my show completely differently. So I have sympathy, but the bottom line is you've got to go into middle age with low blood pressure, strong metabolic health, and doing lots of exercise. And you have to go into older age with good muscles because you're only going to lose them. You're not going to gain them. And there is no escaping the need for proper exercise. And walking the dog, Steve, I hate to break it to you, is not proper exercise. Doesn't get the heart rate up. Doesn't count. So
that's come as a huge blow.
I know. So, so I hate to sound. I have sympathy, but I would deliver a truth bomb on this one.
Did you have any bad PE experiences at your hearty public school?
Oh yeah.
Ever go into the second-hand bin, Harrow?
Well, the worst bit was standing on the Philathletic Club's club table with my trousers around my ankles, having to dance to disco music. I mean, it was a totally brutal, public school plays. So and I was like in the 5th 15, but they somehow made it fun, and I even though I'm not particularly physically coordinated, I did sort of enjoy it. Yeah.
Fascinating. Listen, what a place to end with that mental image. But thanks for listening to our podcast. Really hope you've enjoyed it. You can find us on all the usual social media channels. You can WhatsApp us, as we said, 0333 404 6507. You can email us, hello@preventionisthenewcure. James, always a pleasure. And we'll see you next week. This episode, produced by Callum MacDonald and is part of the Shortbread Media family.